Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to you who are watching and those of you who will be watching eventually on YouTube. We've reached sessions 35 today. At long last, the end of Judea, which is also almost the end of part 3. And it's been a long journey since we started on part 3. So, session 35. Now, during the early part of the first century in the Christian era, that is after the death of Herod the Great, the Romans and Jews were on a collision course, with the new Roman emperors caring little for the Jews' religious sensibilities, which differentiated them from all other racial and cultural groups in the empire. The Jews had gradually begun to hate the Roman occupation, until they would stop at nothing to get rid of them. Popular religious convictions looked forward to divine intervention on their behalf, either in the apocalyptic hope that the Son of Man would come, would inaugurate the final showdown, and the end of the world would come. That was one possibility. And all the evil in the world would come to an end. Or, in the continuing hope that God would send a very earthly human Messiah king to fight the Romans and rule as successfully as King David had done. Many might have been messiahs, including John and Jesus, had been killed in one insurrection after another. But the Romans were still firmly in control. The Emperor Caligula had nearly caused another hiatus. There he is, Caligula. I mentioned him last time. He ruled for only 4 years, was a madman nobody could cope with. So the Roman Caligula had nearly caused another great hiatus for the Jews. Like Antiochus IV of old, he'd ordered a statue of himself to be erected and worshipped in the temple at Jerusalem. But he was assassinated in Rome before the statue had been carved and arrived from Syria. So breathe again. The next emperor, Claudius, again put Judea under his own direct rule from Rome, and appointed Herod Agrippa, a grandson of Herod the Great, who'd been brought up in Rome, to rule over Galilee. And from a coin, that was his look-alike. But there was soon more trouble, this time in favour of the Messiah claimant called Theudas, a religious and political prophet. He too was suppressed with typical Roman efficiency, but the whole situation was getting worse and worse. Under a new procurator, Cumanus, who only lasted another 4 years, there was another uprising at Passover in the year 49, after which 20,000 Jews were killed, when the Romans took reprisal revenge not only in Jerusalem, but also in the surrounding villages outside. But when some of the Samaritans, remember they were at loggerheads with the Jews, when some of them killed some Jews on their way to Jerusalem, the Jews and the Samaritans went to war against each other. Cumanus was recalled to Rome as a failure, and he was replaced by Felix. There he is, the prefect Felix. He captured the Jewish leader and sent him to Rome and crucified many of his supporters. Well, Jewish hysteria was growing. Fanatics among them and others coming from the diaspora even hoped that the eschaton would soon happen. That's the end of the world. The Christian apostle Saul, also named Paul, was mistaken for one of these when he returned to Jerusalem, probably around the year 56 CE. And the long story is recorded in the Acts of the Apostles from 21 to 24. So it's a very long and detailed story of what happened here. Paul's entry to the temple had led to a riot among the Jews, who brought the Romans, of course, to intervene, with the result that they arrested Paul and ordered him to be flogged. The tribune was horrified, though, when Paul told him he was a Roman citizen and had been by birth. The procurator sent Paul to the procurator Felix in Caesarea. He sent him with an armed guard to look after him, of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen, all to guard Saul on the way to Caesarea. But Felix also treated Paul with due respect while he waited for Paul's Jewish accusers to arrive. Well, they did, and they accused Paul of being, and I quote, a pestilent fellow and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Well, Felix had a Jewish wife named Drusilla, and he knew quite a lot about the Nazarenes, so he adjourned the hearing and later interviewed Paul in private. But then he kept him in custody, hoping that he would get a big bribe from Paul in order to be released. 2 years went by. No bribe, no release for Paul. But now Nero was emperor in Rome. So there's Festus. Felix. I'm going backwards. No? Wait a minute. We're still with Festus. Nero was emperor in Rome. He recalled Felix, and Paul lingered while waiting the trial of the next procurator, Festus. Here we are, Festus. 3 days after his arrival, Festus went to Jerusalem to meet the chief Jews. They informed him about Paul and begged Festus to send Paul back to Jerusalem. They intended, of course, to murder him on the way. Festus, however, returned to Caesarea and interviewed Paul for himself. Paul rejected the threat of being returned to Jerusalem, calling on his right as a citizen of Rome to be tried in Rome and by the emperor himself. In the end, in spite of the intervention of Herod Agrippa and his wife Bernice, Festus could not release Paul. He had claimed to be tried in Rome, and to Rome he went, sent there in chains. And Festus died soon after. The situation deteriorated rapidly under the next two procurators, Albinus and Florus, as the Jewish mafia began to cause more trouble. They stirred up trouble in many different places. The belligerent nationalistic zealots managed to capture the hilltop fortress at Masada in 66, and it became their headquarters until the Romans besieged it in 74. A priestly zealot, Eleazar by name, persuaded the temple authorities to accept no gifts from aliens, meaning gifts from the emperor. And this was tantamount to a declaration of war. A peace party quickly arose, led by the high priests and the wealthy Pharisees in Jerusalem, all of whom were men of property and wanted no trouble. They controlled the upper city and appealed to Eleazar and the zealots, who controlled the lower city, to withdraw. But the zealots had nothing to lose. The Jew began fighting Jew in Jerusalem. When another zealot leader, Menahem, returned from Masada, he brought back all the weaponry found there that had been amassed years beforehand by Herod the Great when he set up the fortress in the first place. Now, Menahem succeeded in murdering nearly all the Roman soldiers in the garrison in Jerusalem. And everyone knew there would soon be very big trouble, and they didn't have long to wait. More Romans arrived. The high priest was found and murdered. Both his and Agrippa's palace in Jerusalem were confiscated, while Menahem and his followers were killed. Eleazar, that other leader, though, managed to escape, and he went off to Masada, where later he gained great fame as its final leader. Disastrously, fighting broke out anywhere and everywhere. Jews began fighting residents in the Greek cities, but met fierce resistance. The Roman 12th Legion marched south from Syria under the leadership of the Roman legate Gallus. Things calmed down for a little while. But when Gallus went to Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, the furious zealots fought as never before, and they won. Over 5,000 Romans were killed. The 12th Legion was in disgrace and beaten. The die was cast. There'll be no chance of mercy in future from the Romans. Well, the moderates in Jerusalem, including all the members of the Nazarene community, rapidly escaped while there was still time. The Nazarene community, probably the community of the fourth gospel, which had grown in Jerusalem. They fled out of Jerusalem to the shores of the Dead Sea, to a place called Pella. The young Josephus, now here we get to Josephus, as a young man, he later wrote about all these events, as I quoted from him last time. He also escaped and went north to Galilee, where he joined and very successfully led the rebels there. The Emperor Nero took decisive action. He sent his veteran general Vespasian to take charge and restore order among the Jews. Now, Vespasian was already a well-to-do commander. He had conquered Britain for Rome in the year 40s. But now, between 66 and 67, Vespasian arrived with 2 whole legions. A man of action. 2 whole legions, the 5th and the 10th. And then he summoned his son Titus to join him with another legion, this time the 15th. There had never before been so many Romans in Judea. When you think each legion consisted of 5,200 infantry, that's over 15,000, and 300 cavalry, that's another 9,000. You know, there were never so many Jews in Jerusalem, but this time they meant business, and the Jews didn't stand a chance. Galilee received the first onslaught and was soon subdued. Josephus was captured, but before he could be crucified or executed, he uttered a prophecy that Vespasian would become the new emperor. Wow. Well, he was committed to prison instead, where he had time to think about his own position in life. Meanwhile, in the year 68, just as Vespasian began his assault southwards towards Jerusalem, news arrived of Nero's suicide in Rome, and there was a vacuum on the throne. Titus persuaded his father to go to Rome straight away, which he did indeed, and he did become the new emperor, while Titus took charge of the Jews and wasted no time in going to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was still full of internal turmoil and dissent, but the people there quickly forgot their differences and managed at first to repel Titus's attack. But Titus had time on his hands, and he sieged Jerusalem. There's Titus, son of the Vespasian, and he got to Jerusalem and began to siege it. He used all the trees for that siege from the Garden of Gethsemane. Absolutely took every tree away from it and built a wall 4.5 miles long. So it was big business. The people inside suffered horrifically, but Titus persevered until in 70 CE, the city's resistance was broken. The Romans entered and captured the Antonia fortress, which overlooked the temple courtyards. There's the courtyards, and down on the bottom left-hand side, you can just see the colonnades of the temple courts. So the Antonia fortress really could see everything that was going on in the temple. And the Jews hadn't liked it, of course. But from the Antonia fortress, they sealed all the temple walls adjoining the fortress and then set fire to the northern gates, intending to gain entry at ground level. But the winds were so severe. The northern winds blew and blew and blew. They were so severe that for several days the fire raged and could not be stopped. It was devastating. Fire soon became unstoppable, and nothing could be done to save Herod's magnificent temple buildings, and they were completely destroyed. Fire raged, and the temple was ruined. The whole of the upper city in Jerusalem was destroyed, with the homes of the high priest, the temple personnel, and the grand houses of the wealthy Sadducees, together with most of their inhabitants, who really didn't want to leave their houses to the mercy of the fire. They lost their lives, their treasures, and their books, very sadly for us. It was a huge devastation. The lower city didn't escape either. Many of the Pharisees died in the encompassing flames until the whole city was destroyed, upper and lower, the temple buildings, and so on. It took a whole month for the heat to go. But when the heat had cooled down, Titus ordered the remaining ruins to be razed to the ground. He wasn't having any more trouble. And in the end, only the huge granite building blocks remained, which had been the extended foundations of what had been the largest and most beautiful temple, not only in the Jews' history, but also in the whole Roman Empire. And it has never been rebuilt since. Jerusalem was destroyed again, just as completely as Nebuchadnezzar had left it 700 years before. Well, Titus left the 10th Legion to guard the ruins, while he took the leading prisoners, including Josephus, and the temple's menorah, that 9-branch candlestick, which had been saved before the mega destruction. He took them to Rome to share in a triumphal parade with his father, the Emperor Vespasian, in 71 CE. I keep on wanting to say AD, but I mustn't these days, in CE. The Arch of Titus, with its descriptive carvings, it still stands today, and if you go to Rome, you'll find it's not very far from the Colosseum. That's the arch, but inside the arch are all sorts of carvings of the victories of Vespasian. And there's the panel which shows you the desecration of the temple and the stealing of the Jewish menorah, that 9-branch candlestick which had been erected after the Antiochus IV devastation, when the temple was restored, rededicated, and the festival of the one just before Christmas. Forgotten its name. Anyway, the Jewish festival at that time, celebrating the rededication of the temple, and they used that 9-branched candlestick as their celebrations. So Titus and his arch and their carvings still stand today. Vespasian sent for Josephus, a little bit older now, wiser, and had become a historian in the meantime. He had successfully prophesied that Vespasian would become emperor, had been pardoned, but had been commanded to live in the rest of his life in Rome. A very grateful Josephus did just that, and so was able to use his pen instead of a sword to write of his gratitude to the Romans, and also a sympathetic history of his own people from the time of the Maccabees onwards. And for that, modern scholars, like us, are very grateful. Well, the state of Judea was destroyed. It didn't exist after the year 70 CE. It was a cataclysmic event, but the 10th Legion still had work to do. The soldiers continued southwards soon after the community of the Fourth Gospel at Pella had emigrated from there near the Dead Sea, and they obviously went to Ephesus, where the Fourth Gospel was finally produced. It took time, but eventually the Romans had taken and destroyed Herod's hilltop town, city of Herodion, and the fortress of Machaerus, where John Baptist had been killed. The community of Qumran took preventive measures. They took the trouble of hiding all their scroll books in large pottery jars in the surrounding caves. And you can see from that barrage of cliffs riddled with caves, nobody would soon remember which cave they were in. The caves at Qumran, there's a picture from the inside of a cave looking out. What a bleak landscape. And they hid their scrolls, wrapped up like that in rolls, and then stuffed into pottery jars with lids. And that's where they stayed. They stayed until they were discovered less than 100 years ago in 1947. The Dead Sea Scrolls, as they're known. Well, then the people of the Qumran just disappeared into the landscape. We don't know where they went. But the Zealots, impregnable stronghold on the top of that mountain at Masada, continued to exist. And see how difficult it would be to conquer it. It took a lot longer. But Silver, the 10th Legion's general, was content to take time. After reviewing his task, he ordered his troops to build a siege ramp tower of rock to give them a road up to the top of the cliff of Masada. And in that picture, you can still see it. It's still there today. A ramp of rock reaching to the height of the top of Masada. Of course, tourists are very grateful today. This is a much easier way to get up there. It took 3 years to build that siege ramp, and it has earned, as I say, much gratitude from modern-day tourists. But when the army from Rome marched to the top and went over the defensive walls to fight the last battle, what did they find? Do you know the story? It's a very vivid one. They found 2 women and 5 small children. They told Eleazar that Eleazar, their leader, had ordered them to stay alive to tell the story after everyone else, without exception, had engaged in a mass suicide. So the Romans were cheated of their victory. Eleazar and the whole of the zealot population had died, apart from 2 women and 5 children. Well, what next? Only the desolation of Israel after 78 CE, that devastating date, when the Jewish temple was a charred ruin, it had a devastating effect on all the Jews scattered around the empire in the diaspora. Also had a tremendous effect on the country folk in Judea around Jerusalem. And for all of them, it was as if the centre point of a spider's web had suddenly been torn out, leaving only a few strands blowing aimlessly in the wind. And if you can picture that, that was what happened to the Judaism, or to the religion of the Jews. Its heart was torn out, and only a few strands remained. Unity had gone. There was no more temple tax to pay to keep them united to each other and loyal to Jerusalem, and all the many strands of Jewish faith now gradually withered and died, except for the country folk as usual, and 2 other groups. Well, the village synagogues became all important now, and especially their schools for educating the newer generations. The rabbis in the synagogues and the remaining Pharisees became all important, and they survived thanks to their well-established custom of thinking of the dining table in their homes as an altar. So the temple altar gone, they got their own in their dining room. And on that dining table, as in the altar at Jerusalem, their food was sacrificed, especially on the Sabbath day, and their meal began, and still does today, with a prayer of thanksgiving. And I quote, "Blessed are you, Lord God of all creation. Through your goodness we have this bread, and then this wine to offer." No surprise if these words sound familiar, for the other group that survived and flourished without the temple were the Jewish Christian communities, who also gathered round a dining table to pray and to eat, but with a difference. Not on the Sabbath day, but on the Sunday, the first day of the week, to remember the resurrection. But they too used this grace, so it's become familiar to us in our liturgies too. Well, the Jewish rabbinical scholars gathered during the next 20 years or so at a place called Judea, mainly the Pharisees, but the scholars. And there they gathered and studied all the religious texts they could gather, and finalized the collection which is now incorporated into our Old Testament and Apocrypha. So that's finished now, by the end of the century. The 2 main emphases contained within them are monotheism and the law. No surprise. They regularly recited their creed, known as the Shema, out of the book of Deuteronomy. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one." Full stop. And later, by the end of the 2nd century, they had produced the Mishnah, an encyclopedia sort of thing, explaining the meaning and the praxis of the law. And this became the foundation document for Judaism as it is now. The other surviving group, the Christians as they were known by now, found themselves at loggerheads with the Jewish rabbis in the way they were beginning to read the Jewish scriptures. They read them newly in the light of the resurrection of Jesus. And it was exciting, rereading the scriptures as they found the prophecies of old, which had now obviously been fulfilled, as if they had been foretelling the future all those years ago for when Jesus would come. And this was just one of the Jews' complaints. They thought the Christians were giving up on monotheism because they kept on talking of three gods, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Worse than that, their Jesus had obviously been cursed by God, having been hanged upon a tree, as the law in Deuteronomy clearly stated. No believing Jew, Pharisee could cope with that. Jesus was not the Messiah. Well, all this was anathema to the rabbinical Jews, as we can now call them, and hostilities increased to such an extent they eventually, in the years following the destruction of the temple, expelled all Jewish Christians from ever again entering a synagogue, even on the Sabbath day. It was final. And this had dire consequences for them all, particularly the Jewish Christians, as we shall find out when we get started on part 4 of this course. So, back to the years following the 70, when there was no more temple. Let's survey the scene. The Jews of the diaspora out in the empire had already learned to live without going to the temple, so they continued as usual, worshipping only in the synagogues. Okay? Jews of the diaspora. The Dead Sea communities had been exterminated by the Romans, now slipped into forgotten memories. Likewise, the Zealots had been crushed, and there was no more trouble from them for the next 50 years. Wait for that. The apocalyptic prophets and Pharisees still looked to the future, hoping that God would one day enable the temple to be rebuilt, as it had been in the days following the Babylonian exile. And the Christian communities had been expelled. Well, we have very little information of events that followed. Remember, Josephus was in Rome, not there to see what was going on, and he was very wary of offending the Romans again. We do know, however, that by the year 132, some people had repopulated the ruins of Jerusalem and found another would-be Messiah in the person of a man called Bar Kokhba. Let's have a look at him. Bar Kokhba. And yet another uprising against the Romans began. At first they succeeded, because the Romans weren't taking much notice of them. And Bar Kokhba declared independence again, and possibly established some sort of worship on the temple site. There was no future for them. By 135, 3 years later, the Romans arrived, annoyed at what had happened, and crushed the rebellion. Bar Kokhba retreated quickly, but he was killed in the fighting. The Emperor Hadrian, by this time, took decisive action to put an end to any further trouble from the Jews. He expelled all Jews from a wide geographical area around Jerusalem and forbade them to return on pain of death. That's if they were caught there. He renamed the site of Jerusalem by a Roman name, Aelia Capitolina, and he repopulated it with veterans of the 10th Legion, so they all had homes in which to retire. Not only the 10th Legion, but some Syrians and some Arabs as well. So the city was rebuilt, a Gentile city this time, using many of King Herod's building blocks, to the confusion, of course, of future archaeologists. A new temple was erected to 3 Roman gods, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, each with their own statues. New public buildings were established, baths, an amphitheatre, and also a building with 12 gates, which defies the imagination. Gradually, a Christian presence was established, and in the 4th century, that's the 300s, a woman went travelling. Her name was Judea. She was obviously a woman of independent means, and she went travelling and set out to find, she was Christian obviously, went out to find where Jesus had lived in Jerusalem. And she wrote a book in Latin of her own travels. And that book, I don't think the original exists, but copies of it do, and they are in print in translation. Get a copy from Amazon if you want to read them. It's a fascinating story. Well, Judea went to Jerusalem and found, she described the Jerusalem and what was going on there before the Empress Helena arrived. You heard of her? She was the mother of the Emperor Constantine. Very important woman of a very important son. The Emperor Constantine was the emperor who stopped all the persecution of Christians. Well, Helena arrived in Jerusalem, and she wanted to find and build huge churches over the places which were special to Jesus in his lifetime. She built 2 in Jerusalem. The Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem is the famous one. That's what it looks like from the outside, a higgledy-piggledy of buildings, with a dome and a tower, and on different levels. And inside, it looks very magnificent like that. But usually it's packed full of people. The inside of the Hagia Sepulchre in Jerusalem. She then went to Bethlehem and found what she was convinced was the birthplace of Jesus, in a cave in the hillside, and over that cave on the hillside she built a huge church and called it the Church of the Nativity, which is packed at Christmas time with Christian pilgrims, and it's another huge church, this time more of the basilica style. And if you go to that church, you go right to the far end, and on the right there's a circular stairs taking you down to the cave, which is said to be the grotto where Jesus was born. Well, we've had Helena, we've had the 3 churches as well. In the years that followed, Jerusalem was full of Christians, but then, years later, in 637, the city surrendered again, this time to the militant Arabs in the name of their prophet Muhammad. Can't give you a picture, there are none. He would not and still does not let any of his followers try to picture what he looked like. All we have is his name in beautiful Muslim calligraphy. He has no portrait, but he had a tremendous influence on his followers. They eventually took over Jerusalem, which was a very important site for them. Muhammad had been there, and on the Temple Mount, he had received a vision from heaven. So it was important for Muslims as well. And on the top of that Temple Mount that had been, they built the Muslim Dome of the Rock, which is still there, beautiful in its goldness, topping everything in Jerusalem today. It's built traditionally on the top of Mount Moriah, and that incidentally, both for Muslims and for Jews, was the top of the mountain which Abraham was said to have nearly killed and sacrificed his son Isaac. So a lot of history got built into that one single place. But with the Muslims in control, I'm afraid there will be no more Jews in Jerusalem until more recent times in our history. And thus we come to the end of the third part of this very long course. Well, next time, before we start on part 4, the Christian experience, we'll take the opportunity to look back over the 2,000 years of the story of the Jews and really take stock of how we approached it and how we will still approach the fourth part, and probably the most exciting part of the whole long course. So, see you again in 2 weeks' time, I hope, Sunday, the 20th of August at 4:30. And if you haven't already, please help yourself to the notes that come to accompany this section 35. Well, thank you for coming.